Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chantal Moyo. I'd like to welcome you all to the Multi-Level Action and Urbanization Pavilion for an event on advancing climate change, advancing climate action through urban law. Without much further ado, I would like to invite our keynote speaker, Gianluca Crespi, to make opening remarks on the new cycle of nationally determined contributions and the need for legislative measures to implement them. Gianluca.
Hello, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today in this event, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to share with you some remarks on the global stocktake and the new round of NDCs. I'm Gianluca Crespi, and I work for the UNFCCC Secretariat in the Legal Affairs Division. First of all, I want to express my sincere thanks to the organizers, so UN Habitat and also UNEP. And I will start. Climate change is the biggest threat humanity has ever faced. Rise in temperature due to human-induced greenhouse gas effects is having detrimental impacts on our environment, geography, communities, and finally threatens global peace and stability. Current global emissions are not in line with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree Celsius. The time frame to reaching it is quickly running out. The latest NDC's synthesis report published by UN Climate Change in November analyzes the NDCs of the 195 parties to the Paris Agreement and finds that NDCs remains insufficient to limit global temperature rise. But it's not too late. The IPCC also clearly demonstrates that it's still possible to limit global warming with rapid and deep emission reductions across all sectors of the global economy. Many effective and feasible and low-cost mitigation and adaptation options exist to scale up progress across sectors and countries. We have achieved a lot in the past 30 years to address climate actions through the Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. The international community has set up a clear infrastructure to address global climate change. Now it's time to put this infrastructure to use and set out clear pathway for climate change action and support, and to move the climate change process from negotiations to implementation. Implementation means developing increasingly ambitious NDCs capable to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Implementation means aligning legislation, regulation, policies, and programs to the objectives of countries' NDCs. This year, this COP will feature the first global stocktake. It's the culmination of a 2 years long process, which included the inputs from countries, businesses, cities, and civil society. It will be a crucial opportunity to acknowledge the progress made so far and the progress that still needs to be made. The global stocktake is a key pillar of the Paris Agreement. It's a moment to look back and the achievement ahead and to look forward at what still needs to be done. It takes place every 5 years, and it has the key role of informing the next cycle of NDCs to stimulate ambition and to make sure that parties, when developing the new NDCs, take on board the findings of the global stocktake that assesses collective progress towards the objectives of the Paris Agreement. In the words of our executive secretary, it will be a key chance to course correct, to ramp up the ambitions of our efforts and avoid the worst effect of climate change. This stocktake needs to be more than another synthesis report. Countries have to use this moment to agree and to understand how we can increase our ambition. Setting up ambitious NDCs will be key, but it will not be enough. Countries will have to implement those NDCs at national level through climate governance systems. Legislation, regulation, policy, and programs should pull human activities towards sustainable development. But at the same time, we cannot repeat history where the poor and the most vulnerable are left behind as sectoral transformations occur. Laws and policies to combat climate change needs to be inclusive of measures that specifically target population and consider the social and health impacts of climate change, in particular on women, children, and vulnerable marginalized groups. Government should ensure that legislative measures and underlying policies are developed and implemented based on ongoing inclusive stakeholder consultations and public participation. Measures must also take into account local context, population, and priorities that are specific to each nation. UN Climate Change, as the guardian of the UN climate change process, is stepping up to further support parties to come together and achieve the commitments they make. We engage with partners in building the capacities of young negotiators, observer organizations, and parliamentarians to facilitate their meaningful engagement in the climate change process and to support the national implementation of the Paris Agreement. We have developed 3 e-learning courses on the participation to the climate change process and to support and to understand the importance of the national implementation. These 3 learning courses are available on the Informea platform and on the UN Climate Change e-learn platform. In this context, in 2017, UN Climate Change with UNEP and the Commonwealth Secretariat partnered to develop the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. It's an initiative that will be described in more detail by my the next speaker, so I will not talk too much about it. But it's a key tool that helps countries reviewing and assessing their legal frameworks to learn from the experiences of other countries. So it's a tool to assess, review, and benefits from the experiences of other countries. There are already many countries that are making there are testing and piloting new experiences. So it is important to share them, and these events will also be important for this reason, because it will be it will help us understand through the following speakers on the efforts made also by UN Habitat in assessing and deforming legal framework. I wish you a rich exchange, and thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Gianluca. I think you already touched on the toolkit that we're going to be hearing from Renee. So I'd like to ask the following speakers to join me on stage. I'd like to ask Renee Gift, the legal officer from UNEP. Please come up. And I'd also like to ask Shamiso Mtisi, the director from Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, to please join me on stage. Also, we're going to have a virtual presentation from Anne Amin from UN Habitat. But before we do that, I'd like to give the floor to Renee Gift, who's going to be giving us a presentation on the introduction of the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to mention sort of one of the tools that UNEP, along with core partners UNFCCC and the Commonwealth Secretariat, developed in 2017 to support countries on developing climate change legislation. So just to give you a kind of background, UNEP Law Division works within the sphere of environmental law and promoting environmental rule of law through the Montevideo Environmental Program the Montevideo Environmental Law Program, which is a 5-year ongoing intergovernmental program, which has many objectives, but the main one being the promotion of environmental rule of law in countries. And one core part of this is the promotion of strong environmental legislation in countries and supporting actors, legal officers such as judges, parliamentarians, enforcement officers to implement environmental law at the national levels. The Law and Climate Change Toolkit was a tool that was conceived by the 3 core organizations that I mentioned to support countries in developing national laws on climate change to support their efforts in implementing their NDCs. So how this works is that, and I'll explain in a bit more detail, but there's several modules of the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. So we have an overarching climate law module, which looks at general environmental law related to climate change specifically. And then we have other modules that are specialized, such as on urban planning, agriculture and fisheries, and energy law. And we come up, not only we identify the areas that we want to focus on, not only with the support of the partners that are working with us in the core partners, but also we identify UN organizations and other key partners that bring specialized experience to develop the content of the modules. So really reflecting a one UN approach. So for example, the fisheries and agriculture module, we partnered with FAO to develop that, and then UN Habitat to develop the urban planning module, which you'll hear more about today. We have, as I mentioned, 4 key modules at this point in time, and the 2 main features of the toolkit are not to feature every single piece of legislation related to climate change. The point is that we receive, as UN organizations, many requests from countries to support them first on just identifying good practices of climate change law. And so with the partners, we come up with like a core set of good practices from national legislation around the world. And we compile them into this database, and we add tags to them so that countries can search legislation on a thematic area based on a specific tag, just to have ideas of what are some examples of good legislation out there. And then there's also a legal assessment tool where countries or users can look at questions and answer yes or no. And based on their answers, it can suggest pieces of legislation that may respond to some of the challenges that they face in their countries. So this is to give you, I can't really see the screen so well, but to give you an idea, this is the kind of interface of the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. And we're working on updating that so that it's a little bit more visually appealing and more user-friendly. But first, this is the Legislation Explorer. And so when you get into it on the left, you'll see the different modules, and you can click on those on the left right there. So you see the different modules, agriculture and energy and so on. And based on those, they're also sub-thematic areas. You may not be able to see them very well, but we identify, so because countries may not want to look at hundreds of laws and climate change legislation, they may want very specific examples of specific sub-thematic areas. And so they're listed there. It may be adaptation or public participation specifically that they want to see. And so you can click on those. And then that should give you a list of, so this is when you break down to the sub-modules or the sub-thematic areas, you can select what thematic areas specifically you would like to look at. And then that gives you a list of examples of not just the legislation, but specific provisions within the legislation that match the set features that you are interested in. There's also the legal assessment that I mentioned. So this is a tool that is developed to help users to identify gaps in their own law. And so you answer like a few questions based on yes or no questions based on what are the contents of your laws. So the idea is that the user will answer the questions based on what they're looking to find. So it may ask some of the questions here. I mean, it could be, do you have, as I mentioned, provisions in your law on public participation, yes or no? And if you put no, it means that it will bring up a set of laws or a piece of legislation from other countries that could be useful or interesting to you based on what this identifies as a kind of gap. And so this is an example of, where you select the country, but this is not so important, but based on the yes or no answers, it says, okay, well, we identified some gaps and there are X number of pieces of legislation that can provide examples of good practices based on these gaps that it has identified. And this is just a quick example of when you click on that, it brings up the examples for you to see. I think, so that's a kind of overall explanation of the toolkit and what it offers. Now, we understand that this is really just a first step. Countries do come to us and they ask, what are some good examples? I mean, this alone is useful, but it's not going to really get the country from having, no legislation or weak legislation to legislation in place. So it's really a first step in terms of supporting countries or users to just identify what's out there. But I also wanted to mention that UNEP Law Division provides assistance to member states upon their request to develop national laws or to review national laws. So there is a technical assistance platform that can be accessed online. It's called the Law and Environmental Assistance Platform. So it's LEAP. And users can access this and request assistance on any part of the Montevideo program's objectives. So this could be, like I said, development of national legislation, or it could be capacity building initiatives. It could be review of legislation. And there is some limited funding provided by UNEP to support these initiatives, but this is open for all member states to access. And I really encourage you to go online and check this out because it's, I mean, and not a lot of countries know that this opportunity exists, but if countries are looking to strengthening existing legislation on climate change, then this is a good option to explore. So, so these are some of the benefits of the toolkit generally. I mean, this can facilitate the development of climate change legislation. It also helps countries identify gaps, and it gives exemplary provisions from other jurisdictions that are good practices that countries may draw experience from, obviously integrating their own national perspectives. And what's next for the toolkit? Just looking forward within the next couple of years, we're currently reviewing the overarching climate change module. So we're always updating the laws that are there because to reflect the new developments, net zero and just transition and so on, countries do ask us for examples of that. And we hope to improve the user interface. We hope to scale up technical assistance based on the requests that we receive. And finally, we hope to develop new modules. Obviously, there's more to climate change than, the 4 modules that we have. And we look to other partners with specialized expertise to support us in doing this. But this is our plans to expand and improve the toolkit in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Renee, on quite an interesting presentation. So our next speaker is Anna Mead, the lead on legislation and governance at UN Habitat. She's going to be joining us virtually, but before she makes a presentation, she sent us a video to play. The video is on advancing climate action through an e-learning course that will be showcased here before her presentation. Is the video ready? Great. to you, Anne.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay, and also see my presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some of the old colleagues. Haven't seen them for a while. So as said, my name is Anna Min. I'm a legal specialist with UN Habitat, and I hope you enjoyed the little snapshot to our brand new online training course on advancing climate action through urban law. With my presentation, I hope to share some further insights into the course and UN Habitat's initiative on climate-smart urban planning laws that we've been working on for some time now, to support also the Law and Climate Change Toolkit that Renee presented just now. Okay, the presentation doesn't seem to be moving. Not quite sure. There we go. Apologies for that. So to start, just to say a few words on UN Habitat. We're the UN agency specialized in sustainable urban and territorial development, with a vision to achieve a better quality of life for all in an urbanizing world. We promote transformative change through knowledge, policy advice, technical assistance, and collaborative action. And recognizing that policy, legislation, and governance are actually drivers of change, we provide technical legal assistance to countries, including national and subnational governments, to improve, reform, or create effective urban legal frameworks. Now, urban areas, as Gianluca already mentioned, are major contributors to climate change. Although cities account for only 2% of land footprint, they are responsible for about 3/4 of global energy demand. Cities are also already experiencing the effects of climate change, such as temperature differences that can be up to 10 degrees higher than those of the rural areas nearby. This raises concerns about the impacts that climate change will have on our ecosystems. The impact is further aggravated by intersecting vulnerabilities and reliance on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, limited capacities, poverty, conflict, and weak institutional structures. Climate change can influence situations of injustice and has an impact on the full enjoyment of a wide variety of human rights, including the rights of life, self-determination, development, food, health, water and sanitation, and housing. Vulnerability and equity issues are magnified in cities, with climate change disproportionately affecting the urban poor, including billions living in vulnerable hotspots and informal settlements. Now, cities and climate change is one of UN Habitat's key priorities, as climate change is rapidly presenting additional risks for those living in already inadequate living conditions in informal settlements. With the global warming comes extreme weather events that are acutely felt in cities. And law, and especially urban law, is at the forefront in advancing climate action, in increasing cities' resilience and in reducing emissions, because it defines the urban forms where land, infrastructure, and basic services can be built, as well as lays out the rules for planning and decision-making. There can be no lasting change without effective legislation and governance. UN Habitat's work on law and governance is derived from several international norms and standards, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. For example, SDG 6 on water and sanitation for all and SDG 10 on reducing inequalities state how essential it is to review and assess the impact of existing laws, policies, and practices, and to promote effective legislation and policies to ensure equal opportunities and reduce inequalities of outcome. All too often, however, cities are still burdened by laws that do not match the prevailing urban reality. These ineffective laws, or the lack of capacities to enforce them, makes planning ineffective in shaping cities and achieving sustainable and inclusive results. Now, law related to climate change is fundamentally interdisciplinary. Climate change law is usually not confined to only one legislative instrument in each country, but is instead sourced from different legal areas, including urban planning, agriculture, forestry, transportation, and so on, like René was presenting earlier. And this is why UN Habitat developed a broad outline for the module on urban law for the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. The urban law module was developed through wide consultations and in recognition of the close nexus between urbanization and climate change. It provides the instruments and knowledge necessary to review urban legal frameworks at the national, regional, and local levels, and to assess them with respect to climate action, also offering suggestions for improvements. We have 5 sections in the urban law module. First, the governance framework for urban and climate planning, the urban and territorial planning, urban planning and design for adaptation and for mitigation, and economic and non-economic instruments for climate-friendly urban planning. Each of these sections includes also specific questions to guide the assessment. We've also developed a companion guide on urban planning law for climate-smart cities to help the users to navigate through and use the online version of the toolkit, providing a narrative description and examples on legal provisions from different countries. Now, if we go and look a little bit deeper in all these different sections, the first assessment focuses on the governance framework for urban and climate planning. Governance here refers to the process through which state and non-state actors interact to design and implement policies within a given set of formal and informal rules that shape and are shaped by power. In the climate change context, the magnitude and the urgency of the challenge calls for an emphasis on strong and effective governance systems and practices. This is why the first indicator is on multi-level governance, which includes mechanisms for vertical coordination, meaning between governments at various levels, and mechanisms for horizontal coordination within the same level of government, as well as cross-sectoral coordination. We have provided here an example on Mexico, but I will not read it through. The next one will be on participation of urban stakeholders, which also Gianluca mentioned. It's extremely important, as well as data collection and sharing among public agencies, as well as their dissemination to the general public. The powers of local governments on steering and controlling climate-friendly urban planning and land use, which should be clearly outlined, including a clear definition that sets out institutional roles and responsibilities to avoid overlapping mandates, institutional conflicts, and gaps in implementation. The second indicator is on urban and territorial planning. Urban planning frameworks vary among countries, but most of them have a 3-tiered hierarchy with national, regional, and local levels. The national framework often identifies the broader objectives of planning and strategies for implementation. These are then adopted and tailored through subnational or regional plans and urban plans. This assessment focuses on 3 main topics: the contents of territorial and urban plans, the coordination among plans, including between territorial and urban plans, but also between these and climate plans, the assessment of climate vulnerability and emissions from territorial and urban plans, for example, assessing the resilience of the plan to the effects and risks of climate change and the potential impact of the territorial plan on climate change mitigation, if its implementation may lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Here we have an example of Turkey on their climate change strategy, which recognizes the need to identify possible adverse impacts of climate change on vulnerable ecosystems and the vulnerability assessments to be carried out and so on. Again, challenges posed by climate change affect urban areas more acutely due to the concentration of people, economic activities, assets, and social and cultural institutions. Together, the climate-related hazards and associated effects, including extreme weather events, floods, air pollution, water scarcity, heavy rains, landslides, and so on, will not only threaten people and their livelihoods and their ecosystems, but also undermine the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, based on the robust international framework on adaptation, this assessment is divided into 7 subsections, which contain the most important elements for using law for successful adaptation in urban contexts. These include the climate risks and vulnerability assessment, identification and prioritization and implementation of adaptation options, adaptation of slums and other vulnerable settlements, planned relocations from areas at risk of climate change, land tenure security, land acquisition and compensation. As an example, the urban law module encourages the use of both infrastructure-based and ecosystem-based adaptation measures in the option selection process, where infrastructure-based measures comprise climate-proofing infrastructure and often include projects such as construction of seawalls, storm drainage systems, and so on. Whereas the ecosystem-based measures harness biodiversity and ecosystem services to reduce vulnerability and build resilience to climate change. I think we have another example here from France as well. And then we can go to the next one. So this one is the role of cities in climate change mitigation is recognized by the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals 11 and 13, as well as the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda recognizes the link between climate change and urban planning by expressing the commitment to integrate climate change mitigation into urban and territorial development and planning processes. To this effect, the assessment is focused on the urban planning and land use aspects of climate change mitigation. The key elements for using law for successful mitigation in urban contexts includes urban plans and greenhouse gas emissions, which includes both the assessment of the emissions from existing urban forms and the integration of mitigation measures in the urban plans, and at the same time, the assessment of the impact of urban plans on greenhouse gas emissions. So for this, we have the example from Norway. We also look at green spaces for environmental and climate services, neighborhood design and energy saving in buildings, and climate-friendly urban forms, which looks at measures related to density, land use mix, connectivity, and accessibility. Then finally, effective climate change action in urban areas requires also local governments to be adequately financed to undertake their functions. And in particular, the measures that have been discussed in the previous assessments, such as developing and implementing urban and regional plans, including the risk assessments, planned relocations, and so on, will need resources to be implemented. For this, municipal finance can be divided into 2 categories, the internal revenue and the external revenue. The local governments are often heavily reliant on intergovernmental transfers, property taxes, and user fees to implement urban plans and build infrastructure, which impacts on their ability to undertake comprehensive local climate action. This is why the assessment aims at promoting a legal framework that enhances municipal finance through different income streams and focuses on both public finance as well as private investments to increase the public funds to cover the mitigation and adaptation costs associated with climate change. Moreover, behavioral change through incentives and disincentives is also considered as they play a really relevant role in promoting or discouraging specific adaptation and mitigation activities on land uses. And here we have an example from Portugal on the local finances law, which incorporates explicitly ecological dimension into the distribution of fiscal transfers from national to local governments. Well, then a little bit of the experience of using this tool. We've tested it in quite a few countries. In 2021, we tried out the toolkit in Colombia and India in collaboration with the Michigan University. And this research actually received an award from the US Planning Association. Last year, we continued the piloting with the support of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation and the University of Michigan to assess the capacity of climate laws and policies in Malawi, Namibia, and Zimbabwe to adapt to climate change. And as a result, Zimbabwe, for example, has begun a process of legal reform to enact its first ever Climate Change Act, which I think Shamiso will be sharing with you later. And we've also applied the tool in Tajikistan, where an in-depth analysis of legislation was done, and the legal assessment and recommendations provided the roadmap for contributing to the inclusion of climate change issues into the planning laws and regulations of Tajikistan at the national and local levels. Now, to go back to the online course, all of this, what I've been explaining earlier, is also captured in the course, and we're really pleased today to officially launch the online course on advancing climate action through urban law. In this dynamic course, we explore the critical role urban law plays in confronting the challenges posed by climate change. Cities, as powerful hubs of activity, face both the impacts of climate change and the opportunities to drive meaningful change. And as our world urbanizes further, the role of cities in addressing climate issues is becoming even more urgent. This course is a comprehensive resource designed for a diverse audience, including students, academics, and public officials. It equips the participants with the knowledge and the tools to adapt legislation and policies on urban planning and the environment effectively. And what is the goal of all this? Is really to establish robust legal frameworks that support the implementation of the Paris Agreement at the domestic level and foster sustainable urban development. We would like to encourage you all to embark on this journey with us and contribute to shaping sustainable urban future. And finally, if I can just move forward, we have the link for this training course. With the QR code, you're able to register for the course and make a difference in the fight against climate change. Thank you very much. Over to you, Chantal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'd like to call upon Shamiso Mtisi, who's going to be giving us lessons from Zimbabwe on the assessment of urban laws on climate change for resilient and low carbon urban development. This presentation, ladies and gentlemen, as Anne already mentioned, is an output of the urban law module in practice that was supported by the Michigan University in the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Energy Security and Climate Change in Sub-Saharan Africa program. Shamiso.
Thank you. Thank you, Chantal. So it's not clear from here. Can I use it? Thank you, Chantal. So what I'm going to do is just to quickly go through a few slides on some of the lessons, opportunities, and issues that we identified as key. Next slide. So that slide sets out the economic, political, and social context in Zimbabwe, which largely affects the implementation and enforcement of laws in Zimbabwe. You can go to the next slide. Our assessment looked at 5 key thematic issues that are part of the toolkit, We looked at governance framework for urban and climate planning. We looked at the urban and territorial planning, urban planning and design, then urban planning and design for mitigation. We also looked at the economic and non-economic instruments. Those are some of the issues that Anne managed to go through. The next slide, please. So as for the governance aspect, go to the next slide. Governance and institutional coordination. We identified quite a number of legislative provisions and policy provisions that already exist in the Zimbabwean legal arena. For example, the Constitution provides for cooperation amongst government departments and coordination. However, in practice, there are overlaps that are very evident when it comes to collaboration and cooperation amongst government departments, such that sometimes it even affects implementation of climate change related policies or environmental policies. You can go to the next slide. As for participatory governance, the legislative framework in Zimbabwe exists that promotes public participation, access to information for local communities and urban residents, for example. That also includes even in environmental related issues and climate change related issues. So the laws exist, policies also exist. Recently, one of the key developments is the passage of the carbon credits trading regulations 2023. So Zimbabwe is one of the few countries that have passed legislation related to carbon credits, and the legislation provides for free prior informed consent, which means participatory governance aspects are included. And the relevance of this to the urban development sector is that the carbon credits applies to whether it's forestry project, waste management projects, and other energy projects as well. So it covers urban related issues. So, but what we need to do is to make sure that there is dissemination and awareness creation around the carbon credits regulation. Next slide, please. As for territorial planning, definitely this is also included in terms of the law. The laws are there, in particular, environmental action plans are required in terms of the law. You can go to the next slide. Mitigation as well, it is provided for in the law, but the challenge is enforcement and monitoring of vehicle emissions. It's a major problem in Zimbabwe. We rely on second-hand imported vehicles, for example, but the law also provides for what is called carbon tax. So that's another aspect that also exists in the national law. Can go to the next slide. As for economic and non-economic instrument for climate change friendly urban planning, we realized that there are various climate change financing related mechanisms that are recognized in terms of the different climate change policies and strategies in Zimbabwe. And for example, the carbon financing issue, clean development mechanisms, voluntary carbon markets, those are identified in terms of the law, as well as the RED. And then the climate change legislation recently passed into law has allowed different carbon credit projects to be initiated. I understand there are quite a number of applications as we speak, although some projects had suspended operations because of, after the passage of the legislation, it wasn't clear to project proponents how they should move forward. But my understanding is that they have started to make applications. So that's another important aspect. Then the law also provides for incentives if one adopts mitigation and adaptation programs. You can go to the next slide, which speaks to some of the lessons learned and recommendations. Currently, Zimbabwe does not have what I can call a comprehensive legal framework on climate change. However, the country recently passed the carbon credits trading regulations as one of the key pieces of legislation. But those regulations were passed in terms of the Environmental Management Act. So that means it's not in terms of a climate change specific act. However, the country is also in the process of developing a climate change bill. So we were involved in drafting the climate change bill, and we borrowed quite a lot of provisions and lessons from this process, from this assessment, and we included aspects to do with environmental rights, especially the procedural rights around climate change. Our hope is when the process of finalization of the climate change bill resumes next year, possibly, we should expect to see some good provisions, hopefully. So that's a process that is ongoing, and we were involved in drafting the climate change bill, but it might definitely need further review and work in light of current developments related to the carbon credits arena, and also the outcomes of COP28, definitely. So it might entail a lot of work as well going forward. You can go to the next slide. In practice, some urban local authorities have established the environment and natural resources committees. We also assisted some of the committees at local level, for example, to draft their bylaws. And in those bylaws, we included provisions related to climate change in the bylaws. So this is something that we are doing at a local level. And I also know that City of Harare, for example, which is the capital seat, are looking at developing emission control standards for the industry. So that's another piece of work that we are likely to be working on in the coming year. So the research also allowed stakeholders in Zimbabwe to understand some of the challenges and some of the existing legal gaps with respect to climate change, as well as institutional overlaps. So the legal mapping exercise also allowed local and national government to identify areas for legal and policy reforms. You can go to the next slide. So the project also provided information used by country experts in drafting the climate change bill. I think I covered that point already. And local authority officials are also using information for formulation of environmental and natural resources bylaws. I covered that already. Some of the assessment results are already being used by civil society organizations. I know the organization I work for, Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, we have been using the results of the assessment in our trainings for communities. And we are also further developing our climate change program using those results. So that's one key issue. And if you look at the carbon credits trading regulations, for example, definitely Zimbabwe needs a lot of support around capacity building for implementation of the regulations. And next year, definitely the issue of the carbon, the climate change bill, I'm sure UNEP might be able to assist if approached in terms of reviewing the bill and also maybe providing some capacity building support to Zimbabwean government and civil society groups in there. So briefly, that's what I can say for now, but I can leave everything to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamiso. At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open the floor for questions. I would like to invite Shamiso, Renee, and N to the front. N is obviously joining us virtually. And Gianluca to the podium for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, could you please raise your hand and ask our panelists? Okay, to get us started, I'll ask a question, then I'll defer to you, the gentleman in the crowd. My question would be for Renee. How do you ensure that legislation developed with the help of the toolkit is suited for the domestic context, right? It's assuming that this toolkit is not going to be used by one country, but is going to be implemented through a variety of countries.
Thanks for the question. Actually, the legislation that we feature on the toolkit are selected based on what our experts deem as good practices. And we try to accumulate a set of good practices from all the different regions of the world, fully understanding that they will not always reflect the situations of the the national context of the user's perspective. So the idea really is to provide some examples, and then it's for the user to draw from those examples. And so that's really like the first initial step. As I said, the toolkit provides that first step towards understanding maybe what are some of the priorities I should be looking at if I wish to develop or strengthen existing law. But really the next step is then for the country to use those examples and take it forward, developing legislation according to the national context and priorities that are unique to them.
Okay, thank you very much, Renee. I'd like to invite the gentleman to the podium to ask the question. Okay, no, you can ask from there. It's fine.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. Mine also to Rini on the Explorer. How frequently is this updated? Because every now and then, definitely there are new developments in terms of policy. And so how frequent is this development update happens? But also the second one is it only limited to the national level policy, or does it also take care of what happens at the subnational? Because again, we have a lot of happening at the subnational government structures. So does it also take care of that in one way or the other? Thanks.
So just to quickly answer, we don't really have like a specific procedure, like this will be updated X amount of years. For example, the climate change, or the overarching climate change module was developed in 2017 and it's being updated now. So it's a little bit outdated at this point in time. Like I said, there are many emerging concepts that have developed in the last couple of years, and countries are asking us for examples of those, but they're not featured in the toolkit yet. So we appreciate, especially in this field of law, it's obviously very important to keep this updated. We have several constraints, funding being one of them, but that's the plan, to make sure that each of these are updated. The urban law module and the agriculture module were both created in the last 3 years. So there is some, it's still current, so to speak, but our plan in terms of improving the toolkit is to make sure that these don't go, not updated for long periods of time. And with respect to your second question, we really select about 60 to 70 examples of national legislation. So unfortunately, we don't really have the opportunity to include subnational legislation. There are maybe times, I think maybe, for example, with respect to carbon credits, maybe Gianluca might know more, or Anne, about the UN Habitat urban planning module. But there are times when, because of the nature of this subthematic area, we need to introduce regulations, examples of those. But because we don't want, the idea is not to provide an exhaustive list of all the legislation that exists on this, just a few key good practice examples that countries can draw on, because there are other tools, there are other platforms where you can have access to all of the climate change legislation. But I do, take your point that these are sometimes the most relevant pieces of legislation that you need to look at. We just are not able to feature everything. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, I have a question for Shamiso as well. I'll ask a question to Gianluca, and one for you, Anne. So I'll start with the one for Anne. Anne, who can take the e-learning course on advancing climate change action through urban law? And for Shamiso, what are the main challenges you have faced in applying the urban law module to assess Zimbabwe's national framework on urban law and climate change? And how did you overcome such challenges? For Gianluca, I just want a very, very quick one on the global stocktake that you spoke quite a lot about in your keynote address. Is there any challenge that you have faced in terms of including subnational level governments into the process of the global stocktake? Thanks. So I'll start with a response from Anne, then we'll come to Shamiso, and we'll conclude with Gianluca. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you. So the online course is actually available for anyone and everyone. It's free of charge, and you just need to register on the UN Habitat Learn website. And yes, it is for anyone, for students, for government officials, for academics, for anyone who's interested to learn a little bit more and to see where we're coming from. So thank you.
Over to you, Shamiso.
Yeah, thank you. One of the key challenges was trying to identify climate change related provisions in existing legislation because the current legal framework is scattered in different sectors, the water sector, the mining sector, broadly the environmental sector, the forest sector, and so forth. So I think our team struggled to identify climate-specific provisions from those different sectors. So it was a huge work, to be honest, and to check and identify the relevant provisions. That's one. Then number two, the issue of stakeholder awareness of existing legislation was also identified as a major challenge, which means even if we pass the climate change bill into law, we need to build local community capacity and also even the capacity of local authorities themselves, especially the councillors, the elected officials, because many of them are not aware of the existing legislation, even though they are representatives of the people. So there's need to enhance capacity building. So those are the two I can quickly identify as problems. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Shamiso. Gianluca?
Thanks. Okay, yes. Yes, as I mentioned before, the global stocktake was a 2 years long process that started in Glasgow in 2021, and it had 3 phases. The information collection phase, where there were calls for a submission and information and contributions were received from cities, countries, observer organizations. There was a synthesis phases where the Secretariat organized dialogues, 2 dialogues per year, and synthesis reports on all the information collected. And now at this scope, there will be the political phase where, based on the synthesis report and on all the information collected, countries will have to draw conclusions and make recommendations for the future. It's a purely political process. So we hope that countries will be ambitious enough to lay down ambitious roadmap and ambitious recommendations. And we hope that those recommendations will be used by countries when updating in 2025 the next round of NDCs.
Okay, thank you so much, Gianluca. I hand over applause for our panelists this afternoon. So ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our session, our event. We had presentations on the urban law module with the launch of the 2023 e-learning course on advancing climate action through urban law. And we also had a case study from Zimbabwe on the impact that the urban law module has had in real time, as well as the results that have emanated from that. I'd like to thank our panelists this afternoon. I'd like to thank UN Habitat. I'd like to thank UNEP, guests from UNFCCC, as well as our partners, Conrad Adenauer Stiftung, and have a good afternoon further.